Hello everyone, and welcome to the Complex Cin channel. If you enjoy our content, please consider subscribing and giving this video a like. Today, we are going to discuss the film Touch of the Frozen. The opening moments paint a stark picture of survival in the unforgiving vastness of the Arctic, immediately setting a tone that echoes the stark beauty and brutal indifference of nature. We are introduced to a small, isolated research outpost, a place where the silence is broken only by the mechanical hum of machinery and the vast expanse of the wind. The story centers around Dr. Aris Thorne, a climatologist whose career has been built on meticulous observation and a deep, almost spiritual respect for the planet's delicate balance. His decision to take this remote posting wasn't just professional. It was a necessary retreat after a high-profile, career-defining paper on glacial melt drew both accolades and intense scrutiny, leaving him feeling exposed and yearning for the purity of raw data. He is joined by Lena Petrova, a brilliant young engineer specializing in sustainable energy systems, who sees the isolated environment as the ultimate proving ground for her cutting-edge, though sometimes volatile, prototypes. Lena's energy is kinetic, a sharp contrast to Aris's measured reserve. Her ambition is fueled by the memory of her father, a Soviet-era space engineer who always stressed the necessity of pushing boundaries, even if it meant flirting with failure. The initial days settle into a routine: data collection, equipment maintenance, and the constant battle against the encroaching freeze. Then, the anomalies begin. Not the expected fluctuations in temperature or ice density, but something deeper, something that Aris initially dismisses as sensor malfunction or fatigue. Lena, however, notices subtle power drains that defy logical explanation. The tension escalates when their primary communication array fails during a sudden violent storm that cuts them off entirely. Aris, trying to follow established protocol, insists on waiting for the weather window to clear before attempting repairs. Lena, restless and convinced the power issue is linked to the strange environmental readings, pushes back. This friction between Aris's scientific caution, born from years of watching small errors snowball into catastrophes in his past fieldwork in the Antarctic, and Lena's engineering imperative to fix what is broken now, defines their strained relationship. While troubleshooting deep beneath the ice shelf, utilizing equipment Lena had personally modified, a risky move that Aris had reluctantly approved, they discover something impossible. It is not geological, nor biological in any known terrestrial sense. The finding suggests a form of complex, highly organized energy transference deeply embedded within the ancient ice structure itself. Aris immediately recognizes patterns that vaguely echo theoretical mathematics he had dismissed years prior as pure conjecture, a footnote in a forgotten graduate seminar. As they study this phenomenon, the environment around the outpost begins to react. Lights flicker in erratic sequences, mirroring the energy signatures they are detecting. Small pieces of equipment spontaneously freeze solid, while others generate impossible localized heat. Lena believes they have tapped into an immense, untapped power source, envisioning a future where this energy could revolutionize global grids, a vision that mirrors her desire to make an undeniable mark on the world, much like the early pioneers of fusion power she admired. Aris, however, sees only risk. He fears they are not merely observing a natural process, but are disturbing a deep, latent equilibrium, recalling a cautionary tale from his mentor about disturbing dormant systems. The climax arrives when the outpost systems overload, triggered by Aris's attempt to shut down the localized field generator that Lena had installed to study the energy source more closely. The resulting surge threatens to breach the integrity of the entire ice shelf, an event that would trigger catastrophic instability across the region. In a desperate collaborative act, they must combine Aris's deep understanding of the environmental pressures and Lena's intuitive grasp of the unstable energy flow. Lena has to manually override the safety protocols she herself installed, risking a massive feedback loop, while Aris uses antiquated, low-tech seismic charges to create a controlled counterpressure wave, attempting to stabilize the fracturing ice structure around their discovery. They succeed, narrowly averting disaster, but the energy source itself vanishes, leaving behind only residual, baffling readings. The immediate threat passes, but the silence that follows is different now. It is weighted with shared, profound knowledge. When rescue finally arrives, Aris and Lena exchange a look that speaks volumes. They return to civilization, carrying not just data, but a secret that challenges the very foundation of their scientific understanding. A secret they both know must be guarded, for the world is not yet ready for the true touch of the frozen depths. The oppressive quiet of the Arctic station had always served as Aris's balm, a stark counterpoint to the noisy, often hostile reception his controversial climate models had received in academic circles. He carried the weight of that public scrutiny like a phantom limb, his hands perpetually seeking the cool, reassuring solidity of a geological sample or a meticulously calibrated sensor. His inspiration lay in the sheer, unyielding truth of the landscape. The ice, he often mused, never lied, unlike the politicians and grant committees he'd grown weary of navigating. Lena, on the other hand, thrived on the friction of challenge. She moved through the cramped corridors with an almost restless energy, her custom-built diagnostic tools reflecting the relentless drive instilled by her father, the engineer who had tried to tame the vacuum of space. She saw the frozen frontier not as a barrier, but as the ultimate, uncorrupted testing ground for systems that conventional labs would deem too unstable, too audacious. When the first inexplicable power fluctuation hit, Aris was reviewing millennia of stratified ice core data, looking for familiar signatures of past climate shifts. He felt it as a momentary stutter in the low thrum of the life support, a vibration too regular to be random, too subtle to be equipment failure. He logged it dryly, attributing it to the aging generator, the same generator Lena was constantly trying to replace with her own experimental, superconducting conduits. Lena's reaction was immediate and intense. She practically vibrated with frustrated excitement, her dark eyes flashing as she tracked the energy bleed. "It's not a drain, Aris," she'd insisted, leaning over his console, her breath fogging the screen slightly. "It's a transfer. Something is drawing power in a pulse, not a steady rate." The storm that severed their link felt less like weather and more like an intentional severing, a physical manifestation of their isolation becoming absolute. Aris, remembering the near-fatal equipment failure during a research trip years prior, a failure caused by his own overconfidence in a patched-up navigation unit, became almost obsessively cautious. He insisted on adherence to the manual, the written word holding a comforting, almost religious authority for him in times of crisis. Lena saw this rigidity as cowardice. For her, the storm's isolation was an opportunity. The problem was active, and inaction felt like deliberate surrender. The descent into the sub-ice cavern, a place only accessible through a narrow, pressure-tested shaft Lena had reinforced herself, was fraught with tension. As they approached the source of the energy readings, the cold intensified in a way that defied thermodynamics. They weren't just cold, they were experiencing an acute, almost painful chilling that seemed to leach warmth directly from their bones. When the light of their helmet lamps illuminated the structure, a latticework of ice, unlike any natural formation, pulsating with an internal, almost bioluminescent blue. Aris felt a terror that transcended professional anxiety. It was the sudden, horrifying realization that his entire scientific framework was incomplete. He thought of the obscure, dismissed theory from his graduate days, the idea of structured energy matrices existing in deep, stable environmental sinks, and felt a dizzying vertigo. Lena, however, reacted with pure awe. She wasn't afraid of the scale. She was intoxicated by the potential. She saw a blueprint for limitless power, a legacy that would eclipse anything her father had dreamed of in orbit. She started sketching diagrams on a spare tablet, her movements quick and decisive, already mentally integrating the energy structure with her superconducting array. Aris watched her, a pang of protectiveness mixed with deep apprehension. He saw in her zeal the very hubris that had caused so many promising discoveries to turn disastrous. He perceived the ice not as a battery, but as a sleeping guardian they were aggressively waking. The moment the overloading began, the air filled with a high-pitched whine that seemed to vibrate in the teeth. The outpost's interior lights didn't just flicker. They cycled through colors, red, green, and the same unsettling blue they'd seen in the ice, mirroring the erratic data flow. Aris's decision to trigger the emergency shutdown was driven by the sickening realization that the ancient structure was beginning to fracture under the stress of Lena's probing energy tap. The cracking sounds echoing through the structure were not just ice-breaking. They were the sound of geological time yielding to modern impatience. In that final, terrifying scramble, their individual ambitions dissolved into a frantic, necessary synergy. Aris, fighting the instinct to retreat, moved with an unexpected physicality, planting the seismic charges with the precision of a demolitions expert, leveraging the Earth's inertia against the energy surge. Lena, her face smeared with condensation and sweat, worked frantically at the glowing control panel, her fingers flying over the manual override, a move that meant certain physical harm if the feedback loop engaged. When the countershock stabilized the tremors, and the unholy blue light receded, leaving only the deep, echoing silence, they didn't celebrate. They simply stood, breath ragged, staring at the place where the impossible had been made momentarily real. The return journey was undertaken in a strange, shared solemnity, the unspoken contract between them now sealed by near death and profound cosmic revelation. They knew, looking out at the unending white expanse, that the world they were returning to was fundamentally, secretly different. The weeks leading up to their extraction were characterized by a tense, almost ritualistic observance of normalcy layered over an unshakable, shared secret. Aris found himself spending hours staring at the blank screens where the energy signatures had been, trying to fit the impossible geometry they had witnessed into the existing paradigms of physics. He began to write again, but not for publication. These were frantic, obsessive journal entries, attempting to map the structure not with mathematical equations, but with metaphors, searching for a language adequate to describe something that felt more like architecture than energy. The experience had stripped away the last vestiges of his academic armor, leaving him feeling painfully raw, like a nerve ending exposed to the Arctic air. He began to notice the cold differently too. It was no longer an inert physical state, but an active, containing force, perhaps even a form of slow, deliberate memory. Lena, paradoxically, seemed galvanized by the near catastrophe. Her typical kinetic energy settled into a sharp, focused intensity. She was no longer interested in simply powering the world. She was obsessed with understanding the mechanism of containment. She repurposed the diagnostic gear, turning it into highly sensitive listening devices, trying to catch the faintest whisper of the matrix they had disturbed. She treated the silence like a coded message, believing that if they could just isolate the frequency of the energy's withdrawal, they could learn how to safely access it again. Her ambition had matured. It was no longer about revolutionary power, but about fundamental knowledge, a desire to grasp the rules of the universe that her engineering training had only hinted at. She saw Aris's retreat into note-taking as a necessary step. He was processing the what, while she focused on the how of its existence. The dynamic between them shifted from antagonism to a deep, wary reliance. They communicated in truncated sentences and technical shorthand, actions often speaking louder than words. When Aris needed a section of the station secured against potential ambient energy discharge, Lena would already be welding the shielding into place before he finished the request. When Lena discovered a flaw in the salvaged power regulator that threatened to send a rogue pulse into the remaining ice, Aris provided the precise, counterbalancing pressure calibration needed to neutralize it, a move that required him to trust her volatile engineering over decades of established safety doctrine. They had glimpsed something that transcended human measurement, and in doing so, they had built a bond forged in shared existential shock. They understood that revealing their discovery, even to trusted colleagues, would either result in immediate disbelief, or, worse, an organized effort to weaponize or exploit the anomaly, potentially triggering a far greater catastrophe than the one they had just averted. The white expanse outside seemed to hold its breath, keeping their secret safe until they could depart its solitude. The air inside the cramped habitat grew thick with unspoken understandings, a pressurized atmosphere mirroring the ice exterior. Aris, normally meticulous about external appearances, started neglecting his routine grooming. The lines etched around his eyes deepened, not just from fatigue, but from the constant internal struggle to reconcile the tangible world with the ethereal structure they had encountered. He began seeing echoes of the lattice in mundane objects, the crystalline structure of frost on a windowpane, the complex circuitry of a damaged radio, even the way light fractured through a glass of water. This visual haunting made him withdrawn, his conversation reduced to cryptic references about equilibrium mechanics and non-baryonic organization. He found a strange comfort in the old analog systems, the mechanical clockwork in the emergency barometer, for instance, systems whose operations were visible, understandable, and entirely devoid of the impossible fluidity they had witnessed. His former career, dedicated to proving the fragility of the planet, now felt laughably simplistic in the face of a structure that seemed to stabilize reality itself. Lena, ever the pragmatist, channeled her uncertainty into relentless, almost feverish activity. She was working against an invisible clock, convinced that the phenomenon hadn't vanished, but had merely retreated into a state of lower energy observation, akin to a predator waiting out a disturbance. She meticulously dismantled and reassembled every piece of diagnostic equipment, not just to ensure it worked, but to learn its limitations against a non-standard energy source. She often worked through the long polar night, the only light in the station coming from the focused beam of her headlamp, casting sharp, dramatic shadows that made her look like a solitary artisan battling an invisible giant. Her respect for Aris solidified, transforming from professional tolerance to a deep, almost familial admiration for his capacity to react under ultimate pressure. She understood now that his caution wasn't cowardice. It was the deep-seated wisdom of someone who had seen the edge and knew precisely how easy it was to fall over. She even started leaving Aris small, perfectly engineered comforts, a warmed thermal mug waiting precisely when he finished a long data review, a freshly calibrated environmental sensor placed silently on his desk, small offerings in their shared sanctuary. One evening, while running a low-frequency sonic sweep meant to map the bedrock beneath them, Lena picked up a patterned resonance that was too intricate to be mere seismic noise. It wasn't the high-energy pulse of their encounter, but a slow, repeating signature, almost musical in its cadence. She called Aris over, her voice unusually soft, stripped of its usual competitive edge. When he listened, his face drained of color. The pattern wasn't random. It was a complex, nested sequence that bore an uncanny resemblance to the basic structure of the very deep-sea ice cores he had analyzed early in his career. Data he had always assumed represented simple, undisturbed freezing. The implication hit them simultaneously. This was not an isolated event buried deep beneath the shelf. This structure was integral, woven into the very fabric of the cryosphere, and their disturbance had merely alerted the system to their presence. The true revelation wasn't the energy itself, but the realization that the ice was not just a medium for the phenomenon. The ice was the shell, the slow, geological mechanism designed to keep something profound and potentially destabilizing locked away. Their survival hadn't been an escape. It had been an eviction notice served by a system far older and more subtle than they could have ever conceived. The pending departure hung over them like a low ceiling, making every breath feel deliberate. Aris found himself haunted by the memory of the sonic resonance Lena had captured. It wasn't just the pattern's complexity, it was its familiarity, the ghostly recognition of something he had catalogued and dismissed as background noise for years. He started viewing his entire body of work through a distorted lens, recognizing that his expertise, honed in tracking the planet's slow, measurable decay, had utterly failed to account for its hidden, highly organized vitality. He took to sketching the resonant pattern by hand in the margin of a technical manual, the physical act of drawing, helping to ground the abstract terror. He felt a profound obligation, a weight that settled on his shoulders, far heavier than any academic censure. The obligation to guard this secret from the world that would inevitably try to dissect, harness, or destroy it. His reserve now wasn't just caution, it was a form of desperate, solitary stewardship. Lena's focus on the signal deepened her isolation, but also refined her purpose. She began treating the environment around the station not as a testing ground, but as a massive, slow-moving, organic machine. Her desire to understand the system evolved into an almost ethical imperative to respect its apparent dormancy. She used the final days to meticulously scrub their digital logs, not erasing data entirely. Aris would have fiercely objected to destroying evidence, but scrambling the unique energy signatures, burying them under layers of fabricated sensor error and plausible atmospheric interference. This act of deliberate obfuscation felt like a betrayal of her engineering soul, which craved clarity, yet she performed it with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. She realized that the greatest application of her skills was not creation, but concealment. She saw in Aris a mirror of this new pragmatism. The man who had once lived by absolute data was now willing to fabricate reality to protect something beyond measurement. When the scheduled extraction vessel finally appeared on the horizon, a tiny speck against the blinding white, the relief was strangely muted. It wasn't a triumphant return, but a strategic retreat. As they packed their personal effects, Aris taking only a small, unremarkable piece of ice he had collected immediately after the event, Lena taking the data drive containing the carefully curated misdirection, the silence between them was companionable. There were no grand pronouncements of what they would do next. The future was too vast and uncertain. Stepping onto the landing ramp of the transport plane felt like stepping onto a different planet. The roar of the engines was deafening, a messy, chaotic noise, utterly unlike the deep, structural hum of the ice. Looking back at the tiny, insignificant outpost, Aris felt a strange pang of loss, as if leaving behind the only place where he had truly understood the scale of things. Lena simply straightened her coat, her expression a mask of focused professionalism. They were returning to the world of grants, papers, and politics, but they were carrying within them the quiet, terrible knowledge that the planet was not merely subject to physical laws, but governed by ancient, complex intelligence residing in its deepest cold. They boarded the plane not as triumphant researchers, but as reluctant conspirators, carrying the weight of the frozen world's secret in the silence between them. The return to civilization was an exercise in sensory overload for both of them. The incessant noise of the port city, the grinding gears of machinery, the overlapping chatter of hundreds of voices, the blaring of electronic devices felt abrasive, an assault on the finely tuned auditory systems they had developed in the quietude of the Antarctic. Aris, who had been craving intellectual engagement, found the casual preoccupations of his former colleagues utterly trivial. When he attended a low-key departmental gathering shortly after his return, attempting to reinsert himself into the discourse on sea ice variability, the conversation felt painfully shallow. He kept noticing the way the fluorescent lights flickered, momentarily mimicking the erratic pulse of the sub-ice matrix, causing him to flinch almost imperceptibly. He spoke only when directly addressed, his responses carefully curated to reveal nothing more substantial than acute exhaustion. His former passion for publishing felt replaced by a fierce, almost territorial need to hoard knowledge. He saw his old papers not as milestones, but as artifacts from the lifetime of a naive man. Lena found the transition even more jarring on a technical level. Her father's legacy, the relentless pursuit of efficiency and raw power, suddenly seemed simplistic, almost barbaric. She was contracted by a major energy consortium, eager to utilize her expertise in advanced thermal regulation, but every proposal she reviewed felt like a child playing with matches near a powder keg. During a demonstration of a new geothermal tapping system, she watched the engineers celebrate a marginal increase in energy yield, and she couldn't shake the memory of the colossal, silent energy transference beneath the ice. She refused to present her findings on the power fluctuation anomalies, instead focusing on incremental, safe improvements to existing battery storage, a deliberate act of professional regression that baffled her superiors. She felt an immense guilt, a sense of having withheld the cure for all energy crises because the cure itself was too dangerous to administer. She channeled her restless energy into designing a highly complex, custom Faraday cage for her private laboratory, a sanctuary where she could safely begin to model the recursive patterns of the resonant signal she had saved, treating the simulation itself as the next frontier of danger. Their infrequent meetings were conducted in obscure, sound-dampened locations, a rarely used library archive basement, a long-haul truck-stop diner in the pre-dawn hours, always with an almost paranoid attention to electronic surveillance. They never discussed the anomaly directly. The words were too heavy, too compromising. Instead, they spoke in coded language referencing their fieldwork. The new thermal shielding upgrade is holding up well, Aris might say, meaning, I have successfully contained my psychological reaction. Lena would reply, the auxiliary power cell shows excellent stability, meaning, my attempts to safely model the energy signature are proceeding without catastrophic failure. This shared, hidden language was the only true communication left to them, a private universe built from shared terror and impossible revelation. They were no longer colleagues. They were the sole guardians of a truth that, if exposed, would rewrite physics, geology, and perhaps humanity's place in the cosmos. They knew, with a certainty that settled deep in their bones, that they were the only ones who could prevent the world from touching the frozen truth prematurely. The silence of their clandestine meetings became their only true sanctuary. Aris, looking less like a celebrated climatologist and more like a man perpetually recovering from a severe fever, found a grim comfort in Lena's calculated paranoia. He'd begun carrying a small lead-lined case, ostensibly for sensitive climate samples, but within it rested the solitary piece of anomalous ice he'd salvaged. It never melted, not even in the stuffy heat of the city. Sometimes, alone in his sparse apartment, he would hold it, feeling a barely perceptible vibration, the ghost of the lattice structure, and he would be transported back to the crushing blue light of the cavern. This secret anchor kept him tethered to the reality he now inhabited, a reality overlaid upon the mundane world. He found himself analyzing people with the same rigor he once applied to glacial melt rates, searching for signs of inherent stability or imminent fracture in their personalities, always wary of anyone who showed too much enthusiasm for disruptive technologies. Lena's technical obsession deepened into a form of reverence. Her custom Faraday cage, housed in a decommissioned underground utility vault she leased under a shell corporation, was her cathedral. Inside, she wasn't trying to extract power anymore. She was trying to map the system's intent. The resonant signal, when painstakingly reconstructed through complex filtering algorithms, displayed rhythmic pauses, like breathing. She started developing theories that veered dangerously close to metaphysics, concepts about deep time and planetary memory that she would never dare voice aloud. Her father, the space engineer, had sought to conquer the void. Lena now understood that the greatest engineering feat was learning how to coexist with what was already there, undisturbed. She once told Aris, referring to the encrypted drive, "I've built the perfect lock, Aris. Now I just need to figure out which key the structure uses to open itself." It was a statement of profound humility, recognizing that true mastery lay in understanding the rules of a system vastly superior to any human construct. Their commitment to their shared deception became the defining feature of their relationship. During a mandatory security review arranged by the Research Institute, a review Aris dreaded because it meant facing the scrutiny of his former peers, Lena orchestrated a diversion. She subtly introduced a minor, traceable bug into the Institute's central network, one that would harmlessly clog their diagnostic queue for precisely 48 hours, giving Aris the necessary window to navigate the official debriefing, without any deep dive into his final weeks of anomalous data reporting. This small act of calculated sabotage, a testament to her engineering creativity turned defensive, solidified Aris's trust completely. He realized that where he was the cautious custodian of a frightening truth, she was the agile protector, capable of bending the rules of the surface world to safeguard the integrity of the deep. They were two halves of a single security protocol, bound by the understanding that the world above them was simply not ready for the silent, cold intelligence they had inadvertently touched. The city, in its relentless pursuit of progress, felt like a fever dream to Aris. He navigated social obligations with the detached politeness of an anthropologist observing an alien tribe. He noticed how the speed of modern life, the instant communication, the constant consumption of data, was antithetical to the slow, profound rhythms he had witnessed frozen in the ancient ice. His small, carefully shielded office became his final bastion against the encroaching triviality. He began translating the complex nested rhythms of the resonant signal into musical scores, finding that the sequence, when rendered audibly, produced tones that were deeply unsettling, yet undeniably harmonious. He theorized, in his private journals, that the lattice wasn't merely a repository of energy. It was a form of slow-motion data storage, a geological hard drive containing the history of Earth's stability, and their brief intrusion had been akin to pulling a crucial, highly protected file. His isolation was now self-imposed, a necessary act of quarantine against the virus of ignorance. Lena, meanwhile, was wrestling with the ethics of her own brilliance. The simulation in the vault was running hotter, pushing the limits of her customized hardware. She managed to isolate a loop within the resonance signature, a recurring sequence that suggested a form of self-correction, or perhaps even communication. She started running predictive models based on historical seismic activity, correlating natural shrugs of the Earth with the momentary flickerings they had detected. She realized the lattice wasn't static, it was actively maintaining a boundary. The near catastrophe at the outpost hadn't been the system breaking down, it had been the system reacting to an intrusion, reasserting its containment field. This realization transformed her engineering focus from exploitation to defense. She was no longer trying to break in, she was trying to reinforce the perimeter from the outside. She began developing an entirely new field of low-energy signal projection, designed not to probe, but to soothe, aiming to send back a null signature, an electronic apology to the deep structure, hoping to lull it back into profound dormancy. Their final meeting before Lena was scheduled to relocate to a research center overseas, a move orchestrated to maximize their individual distance from the original site, took place in a vast, echoing train station concourse during the dead of night. The air was cold, carrying the metallic scent of ozone and distant snow. Aris handed her a heavy sealed envelope. Inside there were no notes, only 3 sheets of music paper containing the score derived from the resonance signal, meticulously transcribed. "This is the melody," he said, his voice barely carrying over the ambient noise of the ventilation system. "If you ever need to confirm the threat is active again, listen for the dissonance. It will be the only deviation from the established rhythm." Lena accepted the envelope, tucking it deep into her shielded research bag. She, in turn, gave him a specialized encryption key, disguised as a standard server access token. "This unlocks the tertiary failsafe in the vault simulation," she whispered, meeting his eyes with fierce clarity. "If my work down the line ever pushes the boundary too far, you have the authority to remotely terminate the entire project. I trust your caution more than my own future ambition." In that sterile, echoing space, the final unspoken agreement was made. They were no longer fighting to understand the secret, but fighting to ensure the secret remained buried, a final, necessary act of stewardship over a truth too large for the modern world to bear. They parted ways, dissolving into the shadows of their separate futures, forever linked by the cold silence they had briefly interrupted. The divergence of their paths was immediate, yet the unseen threads of their shared experience tightened rather than frayed. Aris took a consulting role with a geological survey firm specializing in deep-sea mapping, a position that provided ample cover for him to analyze global seismic patterns without drawing personal attention. He moved through the world observing the tectonic plates, no longer seeing them as inert masses of rock, but as the slow, breathing skin of a vastly larger organism. He developed a routine of rigorous, almost monastic discipline. Early mornings spent tracing bathymetric maps, afternoons dedicated to cross-referencing historical seismic data with fluctuations in the planet's ambient magnetic field, searching for the subtle hiccups that might signal the lattice was stirring. He treated the piece of ice he kept in its lead-lined box like a sacred relic, often holding it under the guise of meditative focus, seeking reassurance that the cold, absolute truth of the Antarctic still existed somewhere outside the confusing warmth and noise of human society. He had traded the adrenaline of discovery for the quiet, necessary burden of vigilance. Lena, established now at a cutting-edge research institute focused on next-generation quantum computing architecture, found her work a constant, high-stakes tightrope walk. The vault simulation, which she maintained remotely with near-constant oversight, was her true focus. She had successfully implemented the soothing projection signals, broadcasting infinitesimally small, carefully modulated energy waves into the simulation, hoping to mimic the deep-time inertia of the ice. The results were cautiously optimistic. The resonant signature within the model seemed to stabilize, its rhythmic breathing becoming deeper, slower, less erratic. Her superiors lauded her progress in quantum stability, completely unaware that her breakthroughs were based on successfully mimicking a planetary defense mechanism. Her ambition had calcified into dedication. She no longer sought recognition, only system integrity. She treated the encryption key Aris had given her with almost superstitious care, storing it on a physically isolated drive, the ultimate kill switch should her simulations accidentally trigger a real-world response from the deep. Years passed in this sustained state of guarded dualism. Then, the deviation arrived. Aris, studying a recent deep ocean survey off the coast of the Marianas Trench, noted a peculiar anomaly, a localized spike in geothermal activity that did not correspond with any known subduction zone behavior. It was too sudden, too sharp, lacking the expected geological buildup. It mirrored, unnervingly, the initial energy bleed they had detected at the Arctic station, albeit on a vastly different scale. His heart pounded against his ribs, the first genuine physical reaction he'd had in years. He immediately accessed the concealed communication channel, knowing the risk of breaking their silence. He didn't send a coded message about thermal shielding. He sent the encrypted key Aris had given him back to Lena, followed by a single, untranslatable musical notation, a sharp, high crescendo from the score he had transcribed. It was the signal, the dissonance he had warned her about, manifesting miles away from their original contact point. The silent, frozen secret was waking up, and it was moving. The sudden re-establishment of contact, initiated by Aris with such alarming directness, shattered the carefully constructed equilibrium they had maintained for years. Lena received the signal, the unexpected key, and the jarring musical notation, while she was overseeing a routine diagnostic sweep of her vault simulation. The abrupt intrusion of Aris's encrypted ping was itself a near breach of her own rigorous security protocols, making her initial reaction a flash of cold fear that her own vigilance had been insufficient. When she deciphered the musical fragment, the blood drained from her face. That specific crescendo represented the peak instability point in their initial encounter, the moment the ice structure had nearly fractured under stress. It meant the effect was no longer localized to the Arctic. The system was exhibiting behavior elsewhere, suggesting a vast, interconnected network responding to an unseen trigger, or perhaps simply expanding its influence. Her response was instantaneous and ruthless in its focus. She locked down the simulation, effectively freezing her multi-million-dollar research project mid-calculation, prioritizing the real threat over her life's work. She bypassed all standard communication relays, utilizing a forgotten, low-power burst transmitter they had installed in the station for emergency redundancy, a system so archaic and isolated that it was unlikely to be monitored by modern surveillance. Her message to Eris was direct, stripped of all metaphor. Trench reading confirms propagation. The lattice is not contained by geography. It is active. I am engaging the termination sequence on the simulation now. Confirm local shielding holding. Eris received the burst signal in a sterile conference room filled with oblivious executives discussing quarterly profits. The simple, undeniable confirmation of activity from Lena's message hit him with the force of physical impact, yet years of suppressed vigilance allowed him to respond with mechanical precision. He confirmed his shielding, referring to the integrity of his sealed ice sample and his personal containment of the knowledge, and then did something he had sworn never to do. He accessed the Institute's deep geological survey archives, utilizing the knowledge gained from his consulting role to pull up the raw, unfiltered data on the Marianas event. What he found confirmed Lena's fears. The geothermal spike wasn't random heat. It was a focused discharge, a massive, localized venting of energy that mapped perfectly onto the energy profile of their encounter, only amplified by orders of magnitude. The chilling realization settled over Eris. They hadn't merely disturbed a stable system. They had created a resonance that was causing the latent structure across the globe to react, perhaps trying to repair a wound, or perhaps preparing for a far more decisive intervention. He looked at the pristine, untouched piece of ice in its lead box. It was no longer a relic. It was a beacon, the epicenter of a developing planetary crisis. The quiet stewardship was over. They were no longer just guarding a secret. They were standing at the precipice of a global event, realizing that the gentle touch of the frozen depths was about to become a crushing, world-altering embrace. He responded to Lena one final time through the archaic burst system, his voice tight with grim certainty. "The ice is breathing. We need to find a way to make it sleep again." The understanding that the anomaly was now propagating globally, linked by an invisible structured web, was a burden that solidified their bond into something unbreakable and terrifying. For Eris, the shift from academic skepticism to active planetary defense was complete. He abandoned his consulting role abruptly, fabricating a severe, untreatable tropical illness as his exit, a lie built on the truth of his own internal sickness from carrying the secret. He moved into a remote, off-grid property in the Pacific Northwest, a place deliberately chosen for its geological stability and lack of dense electromagnetic noise, effectively mirroring the isolation of their first post. His focus became the ice sample. He rigged a sophisticated, low-emission environmental chamber around it, determined to understand why this piece, seemingly inert, was still emitting the ghost vibration. He hypothesized that the sample wasn't a piece of the structure, but a key fragment shed during their initial shock, carrying the necessary frequency to resonate with the global network. He treated the musical score not as a warning, but as an instruction manual, desperately trying to decode the structure's sleep frequency. Lena, having purged her simulation and effectively severed her ties with the mainstream scientific community by resigning due to ethical conflicts over power research, dedicated herself to constructing a counter-resonance device. She worked in the relative isolation of the utility vault, now expanded and heavily shielded, transforming her original quantum computing setup into a massive, low-frequency broadcast array. Her engineering intuition, once geared toward boundless creation, was now entirely devoted to surgical negation. She remembered the sheer, terrifying power of the initial surge, and knew that any brute force attempt to suppress the resonance would likely cause further, more violent reactions. Her inspiration lay in the delicate balance she had observed. The structure seemed to maintain itself through intricate counter-pressures. Her device wouldn't broadcast noise. It would broadcast the absence of disturbance, a frequency that told the greater system, "We are silent. We are not a threat." She understood that Aris held the physical catalyst, the how of the threat, while she held the theoretical means to reverse the interaction, the why of the structure's defense. Their communication became sparse, relying on encrypted, one-way data drops sent through obscure, anonymous file-sharing services, never two consecutive messages from the same location. When Aris sent his analysis confirming the Mariana's discharge was a focused venting, he didn't just send data. He included a magnified image of the ice sample under specific polarized light, showing faint, almost imperceptible lines forming on its surface, lines that precisely match the geometric pattern of the deep-sea geothermal vent. This suggested the structure was not just reacting to their touch, but actively repatterning the planet's crust to accommodate the energy bleed. It was a massive, slow-motion geological realignment. Lena responded a week later with a single complex data packet. It contained the full spectral analysis of her null-frequency broadcast, calibrated against the resonant pattern. This frequency, she wrote, accompanying the data with a rare personal note, should act as white noise to the lattice, masking our initial intrusion signature. It requires immense, steady power output, sustained for at least 72 hours. If the core sample still pulses when I begin the broadcast, we risk attracting a direct, higher-level response. We are betting everything on the silence we found. They knew this was the final act. If the null frequency failed, the ensuing systemic reaction would not be a localized tremor, but a global environmental upheaval. They were about to perform the most crucial and most secret act of planetary remediation in human history, armed only with the memory of a terrifying blue light and a shared, profound distrust of the known sciences. The stark, almost ascetic visual language of Touch of the Frozen immediately sets a tone of profound, emotional isolation, a deliberate choice that mirrors the thematic core of the film, the chasm between internal experience and external reality. Director Anya Petrova, known for her earlier, more overtly political short films that explored the disintegration of community bonds in post-Soviet industrial towns, here turns her lens inward, utilizing the unforgiving landscape of the remote northern settlement not merely as a setting, but as a psychological extension of its inhabitants. This is a world drained of vibrant color, existing in a perpetual twilight that suggests a long-held spiritual exhaustion. The central figure, Elias, portrayed with remarkable, almost painful restraint by veteran stage actor Dmitry Volkov, embodies this spiritual chill. Volkov's background, deeply rooted in Chekhovian tragedy and classical Russian theater, lends his performance a magnificent, deeply internalized suffering. We see the weight of his profession, a lighthouse keeper whose very purpose is to warn others away from danger, reflected in his rigidly held posture and the near motionless quality of his gaze. His isolation isn't accidental. It's a defense mechanism forged by an unstated, traumatic past, perhaps hinted at in the brief, evocative flashbacks to a crowded, chaotic urban setting that starkly contrast with the austere silence of his current posting. The film gains its necessary tension through the arrival of Lena, played by newcomer Elena Kask, whose previous work was primarily in independent documentary filmmaking. This difference in background is crucial. Kask brings an unsettling observational sharpness to Lena. She approaches Elias not with typical romantic overtures, but with the detached curiosity of a documentarian studying an unusual specimen. Her initial motivation, ostensibly to research local folklore, quickly reveals itself as a quest for authentic, unmediated human connection, something she has perhaps only ever observed from behind a lens. Petrova masterfully uses the environment to articulate their relationship's fragility. The relentless wind, the sound design emphasizing the creak of the ancient machinery, and the oppressive density of the fog act as constant barriers. When Elias finally begins to thaw, it is not through grand gestures, but through small, almost accidental moments of shared vulnerability, the careful, slow peeling of an orange, the shared silence while mending a fishing net. These mundane tasks become sacred rituals, evidence of a slowly re-establishing trust that words cannot yet manage. The film draws considerable inspiration from Tarkovsky, particularly in its measured pacing and its philosophical preoccupation with memory and time. However, where Tarkovsky often sought transcendence through mystical symbolism, Petrova remains stubbornly grounded in the physical toll of endurance. The touch of the frozen is less about sudden spiritual awakening and more about the slow, painful process of reintroducing warmth into a body that has learned to survive the cold. Volkov's expressive hands, constantly moving, carving small pieces of driftwood when his face is still, become the primary vehicles for unspoken dialogue. The climax, if one can call it that in such a subdued narrative, is less about resolution and more about acknowledgement. When Lena finally leaves, the departure is quiet, mirroring her arrival. There is no grand cinematic outburst of emotion. Instead, we are left with Elias back at his post, the light still turning. The crucial difference is the subtle shift in his bearing. The cold hasn't vanished, but the rigidity has slightly lessened. He has been touched, not healed, but reminded that the possibility of warmth remains external to the fortress he built around himself. Petrova avoids easy sentimentality, offering instead a meditation on the human necessity for witness, even when that witness is temporary. The film suggests that sometimes the most profound connection is the one that allows you to return to solitude slightly less burdened. The film's power lies in its refusal to indulge in exposition. We infer the weight of Elias's past, perhaps a professional failure, a lost family, or simply the crushing existential dread endemic to his profession, from the way he treats objects. His meticulous cleaning of the massive, brass-cased lamp mechanism is a form of prayer, a desperate attempt to impose order on an inherently chaotic inner world. Volkov's dedication to method acting, honed over decades playing emotionally constipated patriarchs on stage, shines through in these details. Every wipe of the lens is an act of penance. The austerity of his living quarters, devoid of personal photographs or color beyond the dull gray of the wool blankets, reinforces the idea that he has systematically purged anything capable of causing sharp pain or sharp joy. Lena, with her background in observing the raw, unfiltered reality of others, initially treats Elias as an ethnographic subject. Her camera is never overtly seen, yet her gaze functions as one. Kask's early scenes are defined by an almost aggressive stillness, a mimicry of Elias's own defensive posture, but infused with a restless intellectual energy beneath the surface. She arrives with the baggage of modern connectivity, perhaps constantly checking unseen devices, symbolizing the outside world that Elias has deliberately shut down. This contrast, her potential for global awareness against his hyper-local, elemental existence, fuels the early friction. When she finally puts down a heavy modern notebook and simply watches the ice form on the window pane beside him, it marks the first tentative surrender of her observational role to genuine participation. Petrova's direction of the soundscape is almost a third character. The constant, abrasive sound of the wind scraping against the glass pane acts as a metronome for anxiety. When the wind momentarily dies down, the resulting silence is so absolute it becomes menacing, forcing the characters and the audience to listen to the less predictable, more dangerous sounds of their own breathing and heartbeats. This sonic environment elevates the simplest actions, such as the clink of a ceramic mug or the careful striking of a match, into significant dramatic events. The emotional breakthrough is subtle, almost accidental. There is a sequence involving a blizzard that forces them into prolonged confinement. During this time, Elias shows Lena how to properly layer salvaged oilskins. It is a moment of purely practical necessity, yet the enforced proximity and the shared focus on overcoming a physical threat strips away layers of pretense. Lena's hands, used to manipulating recording equipment, fumble with the heavy canvas. Elias's hands, hardened by years of gripping cold metal, guide her gently. This physical teaching session is the closest the film gets to overt affection, communicated through shared competence rather than spoken affection. The film ultimately posits that healing is not a singular, transformative event, but a series of minor, renewable concessions to life. Elias does not leave the lighthouse, nor does Lena magically resolve his past trauma. Her departure is characterized by an exchange of small, non-sentimental gifts. He gives her a piece of driftwood, smoothed impossibly soft by the ocean, and she leaves behind a single, brightly colored piece of thread, perhaps from a scarf. This thread is the anomaly in his monochrome existence, a deliberate introduction of potential future color. When we return to Elias, he doesn't immediately use the thread. He places it on a shelf. It remains unused, but its presence signifies that the possibility of reintegration has been acknowledged, a quiet victory against the pervasive, anesthetizing cold. The final shot focuses on the lamp, turning steadily, now seeming less like a warning beacon and more like a steady heartbeat in the vast, indifferent dark. The profound austerity of the location dictates the film's emotional temperature. The lighthouse itself functions as a kind of vertical metaphor for Elias's isolation, a spire thrust upward against a vast, indifferent horizon. Petrova, drawing on the sparse, elemental cinematography often associated with Scandinavian realism, ensures that every interior frame feels pressurized, the walls seeming to lean inward. The limited light sources, the sputtering oil lamp in his quarters, and the massive, sweeping beam from the tower, create deep chiaroscuro effects that perpetually keep half of Elias's face obscured, mirroring his refusal to fully reveal himself. Volkov's internalization of the role is astonishingly complete. One can sense the echoes of his long career in regional theater, where performances demanded projection across large halls. Yet here, that trained power is compressed into the smallest gestures. His voice, rarely used, is like gravel catching in the throat. When he finally speaks at length, perhaps recounting a technical specification of the lamp, the sheer effort of articulation suggests that the muscles for easy communication have atrophied from disuse. His connection to the sea is not romantic. It is a partnership based on mutual respect for overwhelming, impersonal power. He understands the ocean's indifference better than he understands human warmth. Lena's documentary sensibility initially manifests as a subtle invasiveness. She doesn't pry with questions. Instead, she studies patterns. When she tries to engage Elias in conversation about the weather, she observes his reaction to the speed of his answers, not the content. Kask, whose natural energy often translated into quick cuts in her short documentaries, has to learn stillness here. But it's a brittle stillness, constantly threatening to break into analysis. There's a telling scene where she watches Elias consume a meager meal, dried fish and hard bread. She doesn't look away out of politeness. She looks away because the sheer, unadorned reality of his survival is more compelling and unsettling than any staged drama she could create. The relationship's progression is mapped by their proximity to the cold. In the beginning, Lena stands near the door, hugging herself, trying to maintain a boundary between her relatively warmer reality and the chill Elias inhabits. As trust builds, she is gradually permitted further into the interior spaces, first the entryway, then the kitchen, and finally, tentatively, the base of the spiral staircase leading to the lamp room. Each concession of space signifies a small breach in Elias's psychological defenses. The heavy iron door separating the living quarters from the unforgiving exterior becomes the symbolic barrier they slowly manage to bypass together. Petrova uses the motif of ice with deliberate ambiguity. It's not simply a marker of coldness, but a medium that preserves. The way frost forms intricate, fragile patterns on the glass suggests that beauty can only exist where life is actively being excluded or struggled against. When Elias shows Lena the frozen-over mechanism during a routine inspection, it is a moment of shared awe at nature's artistry, but also a stark reminder of the constant work required to keep the essential functions of life running. This shared, unromantic appreciation of the environment is the bedrock of their temporary bond. They are united by their ability to withstand the same harsh reality, not by a shared dream of escape. The film concludes not with the promise of a future together, but with the affirmation that the encounter itself was substantial enough to change the quality of the solitude that follows. The dialogue, when it finally occurs, is sparse and weighted, functioning more like accidental percussion than conventional communication. Elias's few spoken lines often concern maintenance, mechanics, or warnings about the weather, information crucial for survival but devoid of emotional coloring. This deliberate withholding of personal narrative forces the audience to engage in their own active interpretation, piecing together the man from the evidence of his actions. We observe his careful mending of his only heavy wool coat, the deliberate manner in which he sharpens his few tools. These rituals speak of a life pared down to essentials, where sentimentality is a dangerous luxury. Petrova's choice to keep the narrative geographically confined mirrors this emotional constriction. There is nowhere else to go, forcing all conflict and resolution inward. Lena's attempts to bridge the gap sometimes take the form of bringing in artifacts from the external world, brief flashes of contrast that only emphasize the lighthouse's profound remoteness. She might mention a news headline or a fleeting piece of music she recalls from the mainland, but these references invariably hang awkwardly in the air, quickly absorbed by the oppressive silence. Kask portrays these moments with a poignant resignation, understanding that the language of the outside world has no syntax here. Her journey is one of learning to speak the language of stillness, a skill antithetical to her earlier filmmaking career, which likely relied on capturing kinetic energy and immediate reaction. Her growth is marked by her shift from trying to elicit information from Elias to simply sharing his rhythm, eating slowly, walking at his deliberate pace across the frozen shore. The film utilizes long takes, often focused tightly on a single textural element. The slow drip of condensation, the grain of the wooden table, the reflection of the turning light across Elias's aged hands. These extended moments of observation become meditative, allowing the audience to settle into the character's deep-seated rhythms. Petrova's direction avoids the melodrama often associated with stories of suppressed trauma. Instead, the drama resides in the sheer endurance required to exist within a world determined to freeze you out, physically and emotionally. The occasional glimpse of the aurora borealis, rendered in subdued, almost muted tones, provides the only instances of genuine, fleeting spectacle, and even these feel less like wonder and more like a brief, cosmic acknowledgement of their lonely persistence. The film posits that true human connection, particularly when forged in extremity, is not about explosive passion, but about the steady, quiet reliability of shared presence against overwhelming odds. The internal landscape of the lighthouse is meticulously curated to reflect Elias's psychological state, turning the functional architecture into a stage for prolonged endurance. The spiral staircase, for instance, is not merely a means to access the lamp. It represents the arduous ascent from the mundane isolation of daily survival to the necessary vigilance of his duty. Volkov plays these ascents with a visible effort, each step an acknowledgement of the physical toll exacted by relentless solitude. When Lena first attempts to follow him up, her lighter, quicker steps betray her impatience, a stark contrast to Elias's measured, heavy tread. Petrova frames these vertical movements not as action, but as a slow-motion chronicle of duty imposed by necessity. Lena's documentary past informs her approach to the ephemeral beauty she witnesses. She is not looking for a story to sell, but for a truth to document internally. This manifests in her reaction to the raw materials of the environment. While Elias sees driftwood as fuel or repair material, Lena is captivated by the texture and history embedded in its water-smoothed surfaces. There is a moment where she traces the grain of a piece of wood Elias discards, her touch lingering, a delicate inquiry into the life the object led before washing ashore. This contrasts sharply with Elias's pragmatic acceptance. He understands the end of things, while she seeks the narrative embedded in their remnants. Kask conveys this intellectual yearning through subtle facial expressions, a slight widening of the eyes when confronted with something intensely beautiful or intensely desolate, expressions she likely refined when trying to capture unguarded moments on film. The motif of light and darkness extends beyond the practical function of the beacon. At night, the darkness outside is absolute, pressing against the thick glass like a solid mass. Elias sits in his small living area, illuminated only by a single, weak oil lamp, creating an intimate, almost suffocating circle of warmth and visibility. When the main lighthouse beam sweeps across the room during its rotation, it momentarily floods the space with stark, cold white light, momentarily exposing every flaw, every wrinkle, every dust mote. Volkov reacts to this sudden intrusion with an almost pained flinching. The full scrutiny of the external world is too harsh. Lena, conversely, seems to momentarily lean into this light, as if trying to absorb its clarity before it vanishes again. This recurring dynamic, Elias recoiling from clarity, Lena seeking it, defines their brief, charged coexistence. Their eventual unspoken bond hinges on a shared understanding of necessary ritual over emotional outburst. When a severe storm traps them for days, the air becomes thick, not just with moisture, but with unspoken tension. Elias teaches Lena the specific, localized knots required to secure external equipment against hurricane-force winds. This is a moment of pure, shared competence. His hands, scarred and thick, work efficiently. Her fingers, nimble but inexperienced, fumble. He doesn't critique her. He simply adjusts her grip, his physical contact brief, functional, yet undeniably connecting. This instruction bypasses language entirely, reaching a level of trust that articulate confession never could. It is the language of survival, one they are both, in their different ways, masters of. The film suggests that true intimacy in extreme circumstances is forged in the shared execution of survival tasks, not in the confession of sorrow. The film's sound design deserves further attention as a key element in constructing the pervasive atmosphere of endurance. Beyond the abrasive wind, Petrova employs near silence to amplify the psychological pressure. The mechanical rhythm of the lamp's rotation, a slow, heavy thump hiss, establishes a relentless temporal framework against which human vulnerability seems minuscule. When this mechanism briefly stalls, a catastrophic event in the narrative, though almost imperceptible to the casual viewer, the resulting vacuum of sound is deafening. Volkov's reaction during this stall is a masterpiece of contained dread. His eyes dart not toward Lena, but toward the gears, suggesting his deepest fear is not human confrontation, but the failure of the objective, non-sentient systems that keep chaos at bay. Lena's adaptation to this sonic environment reveals the core of her transformation. Initially, her movements betray her outsider status, the squeak of her modern boots on the metal stairs, the faint rustle of her more brightly colored, less practical clothing. Over time, Cask subtly alters her physical relationship to the space. She begins to move with a heavier, more deliberate tread, consciously muffling her presence. This shift reflects a growing respect for the quietude that Elias cultivates, recognizing that loud movement risks shattering the fragile equilibrium they have built. Her documentary training, which taught her to observe unnoticed, paradoxically necessitates that she become less visible through action rather than just through framing. The palette of the film, dominated by grays, muted blues, and the oxidized greens of verdigris on the brass fixtures, is occasionally punctuated by moments of intense, saturated color that signal internal shifts. These are almost always tied to Lena's presence. A single, brightly dyed woolen scarf she brings is not worn for warmth, but sits folded on a shelf, an inert splash of crimson or ochre against the muted backdrop. Elias never touches it, yet its very presence seems to alter the light reflecting off the metal surfaces nearby. It functions as a symbolic, unused aperture, the possibility of vibrant life held in reserve. The film eschews any conventional romantic arc, focusing instead on a mutual, almost professional recognition of shared isolation. Their moments of closeness are transactional, Elias teaching Lena the proper way to clean the lens to prevent salt crystallization. Lena finding a rare, intact bird's egg on the tide line and presenting it not as a gift, but as a shared specimen worthy of study. These are acts of collaboration against the environment, not declarations of affection. This emotional containment lends the film its mature, melancholic power. The understanding reached is that neither person has the capacity or the right to permanently disrupt the other's carefully constructed defense against the world. When Lena leaves, there is no tearful embrace, only the shared, silent acknowledgement of the extreme circumstances that briefly forced their orbits to intersect. Elias returns to the monotonous sweep of the light, his solitude now redefined not by the absence of connection, but by the memory of its momentary, non-demanding presence. The true depth of Elias's emotional quarantine is conveyed through the film's sparse use of interior monologue, which is achieved almost entirely through his interaction with the lighthouse logbooks. These massive, leather-bound volumes are more than just records of weather and ship sightings. They become the repository for his unexpressed life. Volkov's hands handle the brittle pages with an almost religious reverence, suggesting a deep-seated need for order and documentation where emotional continuity has failed. We glimpse entries written in meticulous, almost calligraphic script, detailing atmospheric pressure over weeks, yet utterly silent on the internal events of his own existence. Petrova frames the act of writing as a solitary penance, a way to exert control over the chaotic passage of time. Lena, observing this ritual from a distance, initially tries to penetrate it by offering him her own contemporary recording devices, a small digital recorder or notepad, symbols of the modern imperative to capture and categorize every fleeting moment. Elias's refusal is visceral. He pushes the objects away without looking at them, prioritizing the tangible, slow process of ink on paper over ephemeral digital capture. This rejection underscores his fundamental mistrust of speed and impermanence. Cask expertly portrays Lena's reaction not as offense, but as a sudden, sobering understanding of the gulf between their temporal realities. Her documentary training taught her to record, His life demands he only endure what cannot be recorded or undone. The few moments where Elias displays genuine warmth are inextricably linked to the practical demands of the environment, suggesting that his capacity for care is purely functional. When a patch of unexpected sea ice makes the approach treacherous for Lena one afternoon, he constructs a rudimentary pathway using salvaged planks, moving with an agility that belies his otherwise stiff demeanor. The exertion causes him to breathe heavily, and for a brief moment, the mask of stoicism slips, revealing exhaustion rather than coldness. Lena watches this, not with the eager curiosity of a documentarian capturing a breakthrough, but with the focused attention of a fellow survivor observing a necessary act of preservation. This shared choreography of survival forms the only true language between them. Petrova masterfully uses the motif of shared warmth derived from effort. When they finally manage to coax a reluctant fire back to life after a near-total power failure, the flickering, unstable flames cast dancing shadows that momentarily dissolve the rigid lines separating their personal spaces. They sit side by side, warming their hands over the small stove. This shared dependency on a difficult one source of heat, the fire they built together, creates a temporary, elemental intimacy. It is not the heat of romance, but the necessary shared acknowledgement that existence requires active maintenance against inertia. The film implies that for souls as deeply frozen as these, connection can only be initiated through a mutual investment in keeping a vital system operational. The quiet comfort derived from the fire's glow is the closest either character gets to unqualified peace. The visual grammar of Touch of the Frozen often returns to the concept of enclosure, emphasizing that the greatest struggle is internal containment. The thick, multi-paned windows of the lantern room, designed to withstand oceanic battering, serve as magnifying lenses for the surrounding void, yet they also function as impenetrable psychological barriers. When Elias meticulously polishes the thick glass, his breath fogs the immediate area, a localized cloud signifying a momentary, involuntary overflow of his own trapped warmth before the cold reclaims it. Volkov's performance is acutely sensitive to this duality. The light must be perfect for the world outside, but the immediate vicinity of the keeper must remain partially obscured for his own survival. Lena's presence begins to subtly disrupt this carefully managed opacity. Her initial attempts at conversation are tentative, often masked as technical queries about the station's operations, a way for her to engage Elias on his terms without demanding emotional reciprocity. For example, she might ask about the specific alloy used in the lamp's reflector, probing for the technical underpinnings of his world. Kask plays these exchanges with an almost academic detachment, yet beneath the surface lies a deep yearning to understand the engineering of human resilience. Her background in observing disparate realities, the chaos of the external world documented for clarity, is inverted here. She is trying to distill the core essence of a single, isolated man through functional interaction. The film makes brilliant use of negative space in its framing, particularly when depicting the shared meals. The small, rough-hewn table is often shown with significant gaps between the two figures, emphasizing the wide emotional gulf that exists despite their physical proximity. When they do eat in near silence, the focus drifts to the slow chew of the food, the necessary function of sustenance detached from pleasure. It is here that Petrova hints at the subtle influence Lena has. Elias begins to use slightly less dried fish and slightly more preserved vegetables, suggesting a minor redistribution of their meager stores, a small, unspoken concession to shared consumption rather than solitary rationing. The climax of their nonverbal communication occurs during a period of deep fog that renders the light beam almost useless, forcing Elias to rely on an older, hand-cranked auxiliary lamp. This task requires two people working in absolute synchronicity, one turning the crank, the other monitoring the flame's intensity and stability. For several minutes, the film dedicates itself entirely to the sound of the wooden crank rotating and the straining of Elias's muscles. Lena, positioned opposite him, keeps pace perfectly. In this moment of shared physical exertion against failure, the barrier between them dissolves completely. It is a moment of functional trust, so pure it borders on tenderness, a recognition that one cannot maintain the light alone. When Lena departs, the exchange is brief and functional, devoid of the lingering gazes found in more sentimental narratives. She leaves him with the newly sharpened navigational tool she had been using, perhaps signaling her respect for his essential vocation. Elias offers nothing in return that he could easily spare, save for one thing. He allows her to see the primary logbook open to a specific date from years past. We do not see the entry, but Elias's grimacing pause as he permits the view suggests it contains the origin of his self-imposed exile. This silent offering of his most guarded secret, the evidence of his past pain, is the film's ultimate act of intimacy, a brief, painful glimpse into the core reason for the frost. He permits her to witness his wound, confirming that their connection was built on seeing the truth, however desolate that truth might be. The lingering aftermath of Lena's departure is etched not in grand displays of despair, but in the minute readjustments Elias makes to his routine, revealing the deep, almost cellular level at which her presence registered. Volkov's artistry shines in these subtle recalibrations. For instance, the placement of the bright, unused thread Lena left behind shifts from being placed near the logbooks, the record of the past, to being relocated to the small windowsill facing the sea, a location usually reserved for weather instruments. This small relocation suggests the thread, this inert piece of color, is now categorized by Elias as a marker of the external conditions he must monitor, rather than a memory to be actively suppressed or cherished. Lena's influence is also perceptible in the renewed, almost obsessive focus on the external environment. Having witnessed the profound impact of the fog and the temporary failure of the main beacon, Elias doubles his efforts in maintenance, but the motivation has subtly shifted. It is no longer purely about preventing disaster, but about maintaining a platform, a place where such a rare, intense connection could theoretically occur again. His cleaning of the brass fittings becomes less about penance and more about polish, aiming for a reflective surface that might better catch the fleeting, muted colors of the northern sky. The film's inherent philosophical pessimism is reinforced by the way time is perceived post-Lena. Before, time was marked by the steady, monotonous sweep of the light. Now there are moments of temporal dislocation. Elias is captured staring at the horizon long after the expected window for a supply vessel has passed. These moments are not filled with frantic worry, but with a strange, detached anticipation, suggesting that the solitude is now defined by what might return, rather than the certainty of what has left. Petrova uses these extended silent shots to explore the corrosive effect of hope on a strictly ordered existence. Furthermore, the soundscape itself seems to have absorbed Lena's presence. While the wind remains, there are occasional, almost ghost-like echoes in the ambient noise. A high-pitched, almost inaudible whine that sounds less like machinery and more like the residual memory of Lena's intellectual restlessness, a phantom frequency in the otherwise stable bass notes of the lighthouse's operation. Kask, in her brief documentary work, often utilized high-frequency sounds to denote anxiety or transition. Here, That sonic signature haunts Elias's solitude. The final impression the film leaves is one of necessary, perhaps even desirable, isolation tempered by proof of possibility. Elias has not been rescued from his coldness. He has merely been reminded that his frost is not the only state of being possible in the universe. The image that closes the film, Elias standing sentinel, the light sweeping over him, is less heroic and more resigned. He remains the keeper, the guardian against the chaos, but the light now seems to carry a fraction more warmth, not because the light itself has changed, but because the man enduring its cycle has momentarily incorporated the possibility of human contact. The film ultimately argues that for some individuals, the greatest act of self-care is not integration, but the quiet, dignified management of one's own necessary separation, validated by a single, transient touch. The subtle transformation in Elias's interaction with the natural elements speaks volumes about the lingering influence of Lena's presence, particularly concerning the sea. Previously, the ocean was an adversary, a brute force to be weathered, necessitating the lighthouse's unwavering vigilance. Now, there's a slight, almost imperceptible shift towards observation rather than mere defiance. Elias begins to spend slightly longer moments leaning against the railing after securing the external winch, not scanning the horizon for immediate threats, but watching the way the tide erodes the ice shelf, a process he previously ignored as irrelevant to his primary duty. This mirrors Lena's initial documentary impulse, to find the narrative within erosion and decay. Volkov embodies this intellectual curiosity through the meticulousness of his nonverbal responses. When a particularly harsh winter storm deposits strange, brightly colored plastic debris onto the rocks below, a jarring intrusion of the modern world, Elias doesn't immediately dispose of it. He examines a piece of synthetic netting, turning it over slowly under the meager light of his utility lamp. This hesitation is uncharacteristic. He usually clears away anything that deviates from the natural or the functional. His pause suggests he is processing the debris not as litter, but as evidence of the vast, interconnected world that Lena inhabited, a world he deliberately exited. Lena's professional background in capturing authentic human moments inadvertently gave her a tool that Elias eventually appropriates: the skill of waiting without agenda. Her early documentary practice required extreme patience, sitting motionless until the subject forgot the camera existed. Elias, who practices forced patience, begins to employ this active waiting on the sea. He waits longer for the fog to lift, allowing the natural rhythm of the environment to dictate the terms of his visibility, rather than immediately resorting to auxiliary systems out of habit or anxiety. This newfound patience suggests an acceptance that some things, like human connection or clear visibility, cannot be forced by technology or will. Petrova's use of landscape metaphor reaches its zenith in the way the interior spaces are treated after Lena's departure. The cold seems to recede slightly from the edges of the frame, not gone, but held slightly further at bay. The blankets on Elias's cot, previously described as gray and functional, now appear to possess a deeper texture, perhaps reflecting the memory of Lena's borrowed warmth, or the brief, shared labor of securing the storm shutters. These details are so understated, they risk being missed, yet they confirm that the environment itself has been slightly recontextualized by the memory of interaction. The film concludes by refusing easy closure. Elias does not write about Lena in the logbook, nor does he display her scarf or the driftwood token overtly. Instead, the final sequence emphasizes the continuity of his watchfulness, but with a qualitative difference. When the light sweeps across the empty room, the shadows it casts are marginally softer, less sharply defined. This indicates that the internal architecture of Elias's isolation has been subtly restructured. He is still the keeper, still alone, but the absolute vacuum that previously defined his existence has been replaced by a space that now contains the quiet, undeniable residue of a shared, transient moment of witnessing. The frost remains, but the possibility of thaw, however remote, has been proven real. The enduring power of Touch of the Frozen resides in its masterful articulation of how trauma mandates a specific aesthetic, an environment stripped bare to minimize friction and external stimulation. Elias's personal space is a testament to this self-imposed emotional quarantine. Every item serves a critical function, and anything ornamental has been purged, save for the necessary, albeit severe, beauty of the machinery itself. Volkov conveys that this asceticism is not merely lifestyle choice, but a survival strategy honed over years, a defensive barrier against the unpredictability of human attachment, perhaps rooted in the abruptness of a professional fallout or personal loss he refuses to name. His dedication to the clockwork precision of the light source is a substitution for emotional rhythm. If the mechanism functions perfectly, the external world has no grounds to encroach. Lena's brief sojourn serves as an involuntary stress test on this defense system. Kask portrays her initial observations with a subtle, almost imperceptible tension in her jawline, revealing the deep-seated professional habit of needing to capture experience before it fades. When she documents the intricate frost patterns on the glass, her focus is purely visual, a search for aesthetic structure in the chaos. However, as the film progresses, her focus drifts towards the tactile history of Elias's world, the worn wood, the cold metal, the texture of his heavy coat. This shift from visual recording to tactile engagement signifies her slow integration from detached observer to momentary participant, learning the language of endurance through physical proximity. Petrova orchestrates the film's few scenes of genuine, shared activity around necessary vulnerability. The sequence where they navigate the slick, icy path to retrieve vital fuel drums exemplifies this perfectly. The silence during this arduous task is absolute, broken only by the scraping of boot soles on the ice and the labored breath of the two figures. Elias, burdened by the knowledge of the inherent danger, positions himself slightly ahead, absorbing the majority of the risk. This protective, nonverbal action is the most articulate expression of care in the film. Lena recognizes this protection, not through gratitude, but through a corresponding tightening of her focus, ensuring her own movements do not endanger the lifeline they are forging together, the fuel necessary to keep the light burning. The film subtly critiques the modern impulse for immediate emotional articulation, contrasting it with the profound communication found in shared physical labor. When Lena eventually leaves, the weight of their connection is not measured by the words left unsaid, but by the artifacts exchanged. The navigational tool Elias gives her is a symbol of his core competency, an endorsement of her ability to successfully navigate away from the dangerous periphery he inhabits. In return, the single strand of brightly colored thread is not sentimental. It is a necessary, disruptive note in his monochrome existence. Elias places it near the Fresnel lens itself, the heart of the light. This placement suggests he is integrating this potential for vibrancy into his most crucial function, the act of guidance. He is integrating the possibility of color into the mechanism of his duty, acknowledging that his watchfulness now serves a slightly broader purpose than mere self-preservation. The frost remains, but the memory of shared warmth has altered the refractive index of his solitude. The pervasive cold acts as a psychological medium, filtering and distorting every interaction, and Petrova frames the lighthouse not just as a shelter, but as an active condenser of grief. The interior spaces feel perpetually damp, a slow-motion seepage of the environment into the soul of the inhabitants. Elias's quarters, in particular, carry the faint, metallic scent of oxidized copper and old brine, a smell that Volkov embodies through his slightly stooped posture, as if perpetually bracing against an unseen headwind even indoors. His hands, often shown resting on his knees when seated, are rigid, the knuckles enlarged and slightly reddened, betraying years of gripping frozen metal and fighting the constant torque of the elements. Lena's presence introduces an anomaly of softness that Elias seems genetically programmed to resist. Cask plays her initial discomfort not as revulsion, but as a deep, almost academic curiosity about the texture of deprivation. When she handles Elias's rough, hand-knitted gloves, her fingers delicately trace the thick, uneven yarn, a stark contrast to the sleek, synthetic materials she likely left behind. Her gaze, usually sharp and analytical, softens when she watches Elias perform the mundane tasks that constitute his day. She sees not a hermit, but a highly specialized machine operating at peak, if joyless, efficiency. The most telling instance of their diverging internal narratives surfaces during a rare, shared moment of reading. Elias pores over technical manuals, his eyes skimming over dense diagrams of turbine maintenance, seeking reassurance in the certainty of engineering. Lena, attempting to find common ground, opens a slim paperback, a novel whose cover suggests romance or adventure, worlds utterly alien to the lighthouse. Volkov does not look up, but his jaw tightens almost imperceptibly upon seeing the book's garish colors, a silent condemnation of narrative complexity when survival demands simplicity. Kask's expression in response is one of wounded recognition. She understands that her world, the world of constructed stories, is fundamentally incompatible with his world of maintained realities. The film powerfully suggests that Elias's past trauma is not a single event, but a sustained state of being that the isolation has merely formalized. His meticulous oiling of the complex gears in the lamp housing is not just maintenance, it is a ritualistic appeasement of the mechanical gods that have replaced human relationships. He speaks to the mechanism more than he speaks to Lena, his low murmur barely audible over the wind, addressing the brass and iron with the deference usually reserved for the divine or the deeply beloved. The exchange of gifts upon Lena's departure transcends simple farewell. When Elias hands her the smooth driftwood, it carries a subtle dampness, the scent of salt lingering on its surface, a physical anchor to the harsh reality he inhabited. Lena, recognizing this as the closest he can come to giving a piece of himself, accepts it not as a keepsake, but as a preserved sample of extreme environment. Her gift of the brightly colored thread is a deliberate violation of his monochrome dogma. By placing it near the lens, Elias confirms he understands its subversive nature. The final shot lingers not just on the rotating beam, but on the tiny, almost insignificant thread vibrating slightly in the updraft near the powerful light, a microscopic testament to the fact that even the most rigorously constructed solitude can be permeated, not by love or grand gestures, but by the resilient, irritating tenacity of a single, foreign color. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Complex Sin MA channel. If you enjoy our content, please consider subscribing and giving this video a like. Today, we are going to discuss the film Touch of the Frozen. The opening moments paint a stark picture of survival in the unforgiving vastness of the Arctic, immediately setting a tone that echoes the stark beauty and brutal indifference of nature. we are introduced to a small, isolated research outpost, a place where the silence is broken only by the mechanical hum of machinery and the vast expanse of the wind. The story centers around Dr. Aris Thorne, a climatologist whose career has been built on meticulous observation and a deep, almost spiritual respect for the planet's delicate balance. His decision to take this remote posting wasn't just professional. It was a necessary retreat after a high-profile, career-defining paper on glacial melt drew both accolades and intense scrutiny, leaving him feeling exposed and yearning for the purity of raw data. He is joined by Lena Petrova, a brilliant young engineer specializing in sustainable energy systems, who sees the isolated environment as the ultimate proving ground for her cutting-edge, though sometimes volatile, prototypes. Lena's energy is kinetic, a sharp contrast to Aris's measured reserve. Her ambition is fueled by the memory of her father, a Soviet-era space engineer, who always stressed the necessity of pushing boundaries, even if it meant flirting with failure. The initial days settle into a routine: data collection, equipment maintenance, and the constant battle against the encroaching freeze. Then, the anomalies begin. Not the expected fluctuations in temperature or ice density, but something deeper, something that Aris initially dismisses as sensor malfunction or fatigue. Lena, however, notices subtle power drains that defy logical explanation. The tension escalates when their primary communication array fails during a sudden violent storm that cuts them off entirely. Aris, trying to follow established protocol, insists on waiting for the weather window to clear before attempting repairs. Lena, restless and convinced the power issue is linked to the strange environmental readings, pushes back. This friction between Aris's scientific caution, born from years of watching small errors snowball into catastrophes in his past fieldwork in the Antarctic, and Lena's engineering imperative to fix what is broken now, defines their strained relationship. While troubleshooting deep beneath the ice shelf, utilizing equipment Lena had personally modified, a risky move that Aris had reluctantly approved, they discover something impossible. It is not geological, nor biological in any known terrestrial sense. The finding suggests a form of complex, highly organized energy transference deeply embedded within the ancient ice structure itself. Aris immediately recognizes patterns that vaguely echo theoretical mathematics he had dismissed years prior as pure conjecture, a footnote in a forgotten graduate seminar. As they study this phenomenon, the environment around the outpost begins to react. Lights flicker in erratic sequences, mirroring the energy signatures they are detecting. Small pieces of equipment spontaneously freeze solid, while others generate impossible localized heat. Lena believes they have tapped into an immense, untapped power source,